So we are on DAF Chav Ches Amud Aleph. We are in the middle of Rabbi Yehuda trying to demonstrate that the only way to properly dispose of chametz on Erev Pesach is through sreifa, is through burning. Rabbi Yehuda is trying to create a connection between chametz and nosar, and he says, if I can prove to you that there's a unique connection between chametz and nosar, then just like nosar, which is leftover sacrificial meat, the only way to dispose of it is through burning, so too the only way to dispose of chametz, because of that unique connection between chametz and nosar, has to be through burning. And that's really where we left off yesterday. So, and the uniqueness that is shared between nosar and chametz that Rabbi Yehuda was trying to suggest is that there are three aspects that connect them. Number one, it's not only asur b'achila but asur b'hana. Number two, that there's an isur kares attached to both of them. And number three, that there's a special commandment in the Torah, both for nosar and for chametz, that you cannot leave it over. You cannot leave it in your possession. By nosar, it's lo sosiru mimenu ad boker, and by chametz, it's bal yiro and bal yumatzeh. So the fact that they have these three unique connections makes it so that just like nosar has to be burned, so too chametz has to be burned. So now we're up to the response of the Chachamim to Rabbi Yehuda's suggestion. So Amrulo, third line, Asham taloi v'chatas ha'of habo ala sofik lidvarecha yochichu. So the rabbis respond as follows: there are two examples of sacrificial items that, according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, share this aspect of these three ideas, or these three halachos of kares, iser hana, and lo sosiru, that you cannot leave them in your possession. And yet, according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, they do not have to be burned. And therefore, that shows that even when you have those three common halachas, there is an example we can find for you where it doesn't have to be burned. So what are those two examples? One is an asham talui. If a person had a piece of fat in front of him that he ate, and then he's notified that there's a suffix whether that piece of fat was shuman or chaylev, we're not sure whether that was forbidden fat or permitted fat. So you may have eaten something for which, if you ate it for sure, you'd have to bring a korban chatas. The Torah says you have to bring something called an asham talui, a special korban for which, if you're in doubt, you have to bring that korban. Now, if something happens to the meat of that korban to make it pasul, let's say that meat of the asham talui korban is left over, it becomes nosar. There, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and this is derived in another Maseches, which we won't go into, there Rabbi Yehuda says you are not obligated to burn it, you can just bury it. Okay, so that's one example, where there's an isur kares, there's an isur hana, and there's a mitzvah of lo sosiru, but by an asham talui, there's no obligation to burn, you can just bury it. The other example is the chatas ha'of habo ala safek. For example, a woman has a miscarriage, she has a discharge of something, and we're not sure whether the discharge was a miscarried fetus or whether it was just a glob of blood product. And so she has to bring a korban chatas for childbirth misafek. In that situation, no one can eat the bird because it's coming for safek. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't burn the bird. What you do is you dismember the bird and just flush it down the aqueduct that runs through the Beis HaMikdash, and it goes out with the rest of the dam. So those are two examples where Rabbi Yehuda holds that you don't have to burn it, and yet they have the Isser Hana, Isser Kares, and Lo Sosiru. Now, the reason why the Chachamim say it's Lidvarech, according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, is because the Chachamim actually disagree with Rabbi Yehuda in both of those halachas, and they say you taka have to burn those two. But you, Rabbi Yehuda, you're the one who's trying to prove that chametz has to be burned. Your shita disproves your thesis, right? So shehein beval tosiru shana omrim bisreifa vata omer bikavura. Those things may not be left over, just like nosar, but we say that they have to be burned. You say that they can be buried. That this item of the asham talui that becomes pasul can be buried. And therefore, your own shita contradicts your thesis. Shasak Rabbi Yehuda. So the Brisa records that Rabbi Yehuda was silent; he did not have a response. Amar of Yosef, Haine da Amri Inshi, Kappa dechata nagra begava nisruf chardala. Now there are a number of ways to interpret this, but I'll just tell you one way. That this is why people say that the spoon that the carpenter carves is responsible for him burning his mouth when he takes a spoonful of mustard. Now, if you take a spoonful of mustard seed and you just try to swallow it whole, you're going to burn your mouth. So what enabled you to get a whole spoon of mustard in your mouth to begin with? It was the spoon. So if you're the carpenter and you fashioned the spoon to begin with, it's your own artisanship that caused you to burn your mouth. So it's basically an irony that it's Rabbi Yehuda's own shita that caused him to get burned, so to speak. Abaya Omar Sadno Besadni Yosef Madvil Yodei Mishtalim. So Midivil Yodei Mishtalim. So that Abaya has a slightly different phrase or a saying of what people say in this context, that you get burned by your own work. He uses the example of a person who is a carpenter and builds stocks for prisoners. He says sometimes you get locked up in your own stocks, and so you get tangled up in your own handcuffs, basically is what he's saying. And that's another way of saying that you got your own shita was the thing that entrapped you. And Rava Amar Gira Begire Maktil Midavil Yade Mishtalim. And Rava says another saying, the person who manufactures arrows sometimes gets killed by the thing that he himself manufactured.
It's a little harsh.
Yeah. Now, the question, of course, is why do you need three different sayings for the same idea? I am certain that the Baalei Agadita provide us with profound distinctions between each one of these sayings, and that's for you to analyze on your own time. Let's go weiter. B'chachamim omrim mefazer v'zor l'ruach. The sheet of the Chachamim, which argues with Rabbi Yehuda says you can only burn the chametz. The Chachamim say no. You can crumble it and throw it into the wind, or throw it into the ocean. Now that statement in itself that I just said in English is deliberately ambiguous. And the Gemara is going to pick up on that ambiguity from the language of the Mishnah. So what does the Mishnah mean to say? Mefarer v'zor l'ruach u'mefarer u'mata liyam, o dilma mefarer v'zor l'ruach aval mata liyam be'ene. So there's two ways to interpret that statement depending upon whether it's a hard comma or a soft comma. A soft comma. Are we saying that you have to crumble it and throw it into the wind, hard comma, or throw it whole into the ocean, or soft comma, do you crumble it and throw it into the wind or the ocean? Meaning that you have, in both cases, whether you're throwing it into the wind or throwing it into the ocean, you have to crumble it first. We have the same language in a Mishnah that talks about the obligation to dispose of avodah zarah, and it says over there, Rabbi Yossi Omer Shochek v'zara l'ruach umata liyam. The Rabbi Yossi says if you have a statue from avodah zarah, you have to grind it up and throw it into the wind or throw it into the sea. V'iboya lehu heichi kamer, and the question there too was raised. What does Rabbi Yossi mean? Shochek v'zara l'ruach v'shochek umata liyam. Does he mean to say that in both, when you're throwing it into the wind and when you're throwing it into the sea, you have to first grind it up? Or is the grinding only required when you're throwing it into the wind and it's not being washed away by the water? Whereas when you throw it into the sea, since you're submerging it in water, it's not necessary to grind it up. Amar Rabba mistavra avodah zara diliyam hamelach ka'azla lo boy shchika chametz dilashar naharos ka'azil boy pirur. So Rabba suggests as follows: the context of the Mishnah in avodah zara was talking about one specific body of water. It was talking about the Dead Sea, and since in the Dead Sea you don't have seafarers traveling through the Dead Sea, it's much more logical to conclude that with the context of there, which is avodah zara, you can throw it in intact. You don't have to grind it up because you don't have to fear that someone's going to find it later on. Whereas by chametz, where we talk about throwing it into any body of water, there you should be concerned because there I can throw a loaf of bread into the river. It could wash down the river and someone else will find it. And therefore it stands to reason that with chametz you have to break it, crumble it up into crumbs before you dispose of it in the body of water. Amalei Rav Yosef Adarabba Ibcha Mistavra. Rav Yosef says, I hold just the opposite from Svara. Avodah Zara delo memisa boi shchika chametz de memis lo bori pirur. He says avodah zara is made out of a solid, either stone or metal, And there, it's not going to dissolve in water anyway. So there's much more of a logical argument to require you to grind it before you dispose of it, because it's always going to remain intact. But chametz is something that's going to become yucky and dissolve anyway. And so if it's going to dissolve anyway, so then maybe there's a svara to say that you don't have to crumble it before you throw it in. Tanya Kavose de Rabba, Tanya Kavose de Rav Yosef. We have a brisa to support Rabba, who says that for chametz you have to break it up, whereas by avodah zarah you don't. And we have a brisa to support Rav Yosef, who says that no, by avodah zarah you have to break it up, but by chametz you don't. Tanya Kavase de Rabba. This brisa is talking about chametz because it talks about being mefarer, which means to crumble bread. Hayamahalech bamidbar mefarer v'zora l'ruach. Hayamahalech b'sfina mefarer matu liyam. And it says, regardless of whether you're walking through the desert on dry land or whether you're traveling through the sea on a boat, in both cases you have to crumble it and then throw it away. So you see that proves Rabba's point that for chametz you have to crumble it either way. Tanya Kavase de Rav Yosef, Hayamahalech bamidbar shochek v'zora l'ruach. Hayamahalech basfina shochek umati liyam. And now this brisa supports Rav Yosef because it talks about being shochek, which is to grind up a solid statue of metal or stone. So there, this brisa supports Rav Yosef because it says whether you're in the desert or in the ocean, in both cases you have to grind up the avodah zarah. So that supports Rav Yosef's contention. So the Gemara now says shchika kashil Rabba, pirur kashil Rav Yosef. So let's suggest that both of these brises are challenging to the other Manda Omar. Because according to Rabba, Rabba, who doesn't require the avodah zarah to be ground up, what is he going to do with Rav Yosef's brisa? And Rav Yosef, who doesn't require the chametz to be crumbled up, what is he going to do with Rabba's brisa? Shchika l'Rabba lo kasha halayam hamelach halashar naharos. So to defend Rabba against the brisa that requires avodah zarah to be ground up, he'll tell you that brisa is talking about when you're disposing of the avodah zarah in a body of water where there are seafarers. In other words, not the Dead Sea. I was only talking about disposing of avodah zarah in the Dead Sea where no one's going to find it. But if taka, you want to dispose of avodah zarah in a different body of water, then I agree, like the brisa says, that you have to grind it up first. And pirur l'Rav Yosef lo kasha habechiti habenahama. And Rav Yosef is defended against the brisa which requires you to crumble up chametz no matter what, is because he says when you're dealing with bread which will crumble, which will dissolve on its own, that's the only time when I said that you don't have to crumble it before you throw it away. But there's a certain kind of chametz that will not dissolve on its own. Those are kernels of wheat. Sometimes kernels of wheat themselves can become leavened through I think it's called pearling, where or malting. It's maybe there's a certain process where you malt wheat or you do something to the wheat which leavens the kernels. I guess maybe you soak them first or whatever you do, but it leavens the kernels. And there, it's not sufficient just to dispose of them in a bag. Let's say you have a sack of leavened wheat kernels. There, Rav Yosef would agree that it's not sufficient because those things are not going to dissolve on their own when you throw them in the water. They're going to remain intact for an extended period of time. And there, Yutaka do have to be concerned, even according to Rav Yosef, that someone else will find them. So there, Rav Yosef agrees that you have to tear open the sack and scatter the kernels out across the ocean to prevent someone from finding them. Okay.
Fermenting them?
I don't know. Maybe it's fermenting. I'm not sure. I remember what the process is. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah now says, Chametz shel nachri, sha'avar alav ha'pesach, mutar bahana, v'shel Yisrael asur bahana. That chametz, that is the property of a Gentile, which has had Pesach elapse over it, which means it's been in the Gentile's possession over Pesach, it's permitted to benefit from it after Pesach. But if it was a Yisrael's over Pesach, then you're not allowed to benefit from it even after Pesach. Shenemar, as it says, Lo yir'eh lecha sa'or, that it may not be seen to you any leaven. Lo yir'eh lecha sa'or, I should say. That the question, of course, is, what is the import of this pasuk? Where do we see from here that if it was owned by a Jew, it's asur bahana after Pesach? The Gemara will have to explain that. But before we get to that, we have to find out the authorship of our Mishnah. Who was the author of our Mishnah? That's what the Gemara is asking. Moni Masnisim. Lo Rabbi Yehuda, velo Rabbi Shimon, velo Rabbi Yossi Haglili. We have three Tanoim that we're aware of, and our Mishnah seems to go like none of them. So what are you talking about? Maihi. What does this mean? Detanya. Here's the Brisa. Chametz bein lifnei zmano bein la'achar zmano, over alav bilav, that whether the chametz is owned by you over Pesach, in other words, during Pesach, before Pesach, and after Pesach. Bein lifnei zmano bein la'achar zmano, before Pesach you own chametz, meaning on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. After Pesach you own chametz, that was chametz over alav Pesach. Over alav bilav. So in both of those cases, if you consume it, you incur a mitzvah lo saseh. And like Rashi explains, over alav bilav, v'im achlo eno onush kares. Possessing it makes you incur a mitzvah lo saseh, and if you eat it, however, you don't get kares. And then and tochsmano, if you possess it during Pesach, over alav bilav v'kares, then possessing it makes you liable for bal yirah bal yimatzeh, the mitzvah lo saseh, and if you eat it, you get kares. That's divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now note that according to Rabbi Yehuda, chametz she'over alav haPesach is a deoraisa. You're in violation midioraisa of it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, chametz lifnei zmano ula'achar zmano, ena over alav below klum. Rabbi Shimon says that whether you're in possession of chametz before Pesach, meaning after Chatzos on Erev Pesach, or whether you're in possession of it after Pesach, and it was chametz shavar lava Pesach, there is no Torah violation, but tos mano, over alav bikares uvilav. But if it's in your possession over Pesach itself, so then you incur bilav v'kares. In other words, that's they changed the gears around. Over alav bilav uv'kares. Then you incur a mitzvah lo saseh of having it in your possession, and if you eat it, you get kares. And then the Brisa makes a strange statement if we're still discussing Rabbi Shimon, because it says umisha'a sha'asr ba'achila asr b'hana, that from the moment that you're not allowed to eat it, which is from the from Chatzos and onwards on Erev Pesach, you're also not allowed to benefit from it, which seems that what this statement means is that there is a mitzvah lo saseh of bal yirah bal yimatzeh, even on Erev Pesach. So the Gemara interjects in the middle of this brisa and says, Asa and Latanakama, exclamation point. This seems to be reverting back to Rabbi Yehuda, the first Tana. Because according to Reb Shimon, he had just got through saying that there is no violation midioraisa of having chametz in your possession on Erev Pesach. So it doesn't seem to make any sense. So the Gemara is going to have to address this, but for now it's just posing it as a question. And now we're going to resume our discussion. We're going to resume the brisa. Now we have the third opinion. So far we've seen Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says that there's an isser of possession Erev Pesach and also after Pesach if it's chametz shavar lava Pesach. And Reb Shimon says there is no biblical violation of ownership of chametz either on Erev Pesach after Chatzos or after Pesach if you have chametz shavar lava Pesach. And Reb Yossi Haglili Omer Tamei al atzmecha Hey chametz asur bahana kol shiva. And Rabbi Yossi says you should astonish yourself. In other words, you should be surprised at yourself. How can anyone even suggest that there's an isser of hana'ah before or after Pesach when I hold that there's no isser hana'ah even during Pesach? In other words, there's no isser of getting benefit from your chametz. You can have chametz in your possession and benefit from it even on Pesach. So we're going to have to analyze Rabbi Yossi Haglili's position. We're going to have to actually analyze all three positions, but let's continue and resume the brisa.
Before Pesach, after Pesach, naturally he has it during Pesach too.
We're saying if he had it during Pesach, then he's in violation of owning it even after Pesach, according to Rabbi Yehuda. But that's only according to Rabbi Yehuda. So now let's resume. Uminayin la'ochel chametz misheishos ulamayla shu over below sa'aseh. Now let's go back to Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, how do you know that if you eat chametz after chatzos, that you're going to incur a mitzvah lo sa'aseh? Shenamar, as it says, lo sochal olav chametz. The Torah says you may not eat upon it, which refers to the Korban Pesach, chametz. You cannot eat chametz with the Korban Pesach. So, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda basically learns from there is that any time that you can start offering the Korban Pesach is when the Isra chametz sets in. When's the earliest time you can start bringing the Korban Pesach? Chatzos. And therefore, that's when the Isra chametz of Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotzei sets in. Amar lo Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon says to him, B'chi efshar lo markein. How could you say such a thing? V'alo kvar nemar lo sochal olav chametz shivas yomim tochal olav matzos. The second part of that pasuk says that for 7 days of Pesach you shall eat matzos. So the whole context of that pasuk is not talking about Erev Pesach. It's talking about the 7 days of Pesach. It's talking about when there's a mitzvah to eat matzah that you shall not eat chametz. So im kein matam alomer lo sochal olav chametz. So therefore, how do I interpret the pasuk? V'shah sheyeshno bekum achol matzah, yeshno beval tochal chametz. V'shah she'eno bekum achol matzah, eno beval tochal chametz. So therefore, the way I interpret the pasuk is that the only time that there is the only time that there's an isser of chametz is when there's a positive obligation to eat matzah. But kolzman that there's no positive obligation to eat matzah, there's no prohibition of owning chametz. And that's why Reb Shimon says that both on Erev Pesach and after Pesach, there's no biblical violation if you're in possession of chametz, or even if you are eating chametz. There's no biblical violation. My time of the Rebbe Yehuda. So now the Brisa continues, and it says, what is Rebbe Yehuda's reasoning for saying that both on Erev Pesach and after Pesach there's an Isser Achila and an Isser Hana'ah of chametz? So he says, Tlasa Kroi Ksivi. He says, because we have 3 psukim. Lo ye'achel chametz, v'chol machmetzes lo sochelu, and lo sochalo lov chametz. You have 3 psukim. So what are these? Why do you need 3 psukim when one would have sufficed? Chad lifnei zmano, v'chad la'achar zmano, v'chad l'soch zmano. One pasuk is to tell you during Pesach itself it's chametz is aser. Another pasuk is telling you that before chametz, before Pesach, chametz is aser, on Erev Pesach. And one is telling you that after Pesach, when it's chametz shavar lava Pesach, chametz is going to be aser. So Rashi points out at the bottom of the DAF that there are many more psukim that talk about the Yisr of chametz, but we're only focusing on these 3 for right now. Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon will tell you, Chad l'soch zmano, and he says, no, there's only one pasuk that you can use for this drasha. And since there's only one pasuk, that one pasuk tells you that chametz is aser only during the 7 days of Pesach. So what do I do with the other 2 psukim? I have another use for them. V'chol machmetzes miboy le'lichedetanya. The reason why I need v'chol machmetzes lo sochelu is for the following brisa. Chametz ein li eloshen is chametz me'elav. Machmas davar acher minayin tamolomar kol machmetzes lo sochelu. So he says, look, the word chametz only implies when dough becomes leavened through another dough product. Now, normally, how do you manufacture yeast? Yeast is manufactured, can be manufactured from any item that is subject to leavening. But typically, the way that you make yeast is from sourdough. In other words, from fermented dough. So the word chametz implies that something that becomes chametz from its own kind, from the fermentation of dough itself. How do you know that if dough ferments from a foreign object, like Tosfos speaks out, like, let's say, from dregs, from wine dregs? Wine dregs have fermentation power because they in themselves are a product of fermentation. So how do you know that if you ferment dough with a grape product, that you're also subject to the Yisr of chametz? That's why you need the words kol machmetzes, to tell you that even when the leavening agent is not made from dough itself, but from a foreign source, that also qualifies as chametz. And that's why you have to use the words kol machmetzes. Lo ye'achel chametz, and the other pasuk that you use, Rabbi Yehuda, I also have a different purpose for it. Miboy le'lechidetanya, like the Brisa says, Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, minayin lePesach Mitzrayim she'en chimutzo noheg ela yom echad. How do you know that historically the first Pesach that the Jewish people had, which was the 15th of Nisan, in the year 2448, on the day that they left Egypt, how do you know that that the Isser of Chametz only applied on the 15th of Nisan, but there was no longer an Isser of Chametz on the 16th of Nisan? This was a unique experience. It was a unique Pesach holiday. How do I know that? And the Gemara will expound on this later on. Talmud Omar lo ye'achel chametz v'samach lehayom atem yotzim, because the Torah says chametz may not be eaten, and then right afterwards it says today you are leaving. So you read it as lo ye'achel chametz hayom, that only today chametz may not be eaten, but tomorrow chametz may be. Now, Rabbi Yehuda machmas davar acher minole. So now Rabbi Yehuda, who uses the two aforementioned psukim to teach me that chametz is aser both before and after Pesach, where does he learn Rabbi Shimon's teachings that a machmetzes, which means that when the leavening agent is from a foreign source, that's also considered chametz? How does he know that? Mida'afke rachmana b'lashon machmetzes. He says no, you can kill two birds with one stone. I have that pasuk which says that you may not eat machmetzes. So that pasuk in toto is used to teach me that chametz before or after Pesach is also going to be aser, and the fact that the Torah used the word machmetzes instead of chametz teaches me the additional principle that if the leavening agent is from grapes and not from dough, then it's also considered chametz. So you get both benefits from that pasuk. The Rabbi Yossi Haglili Minali, and where does he know Rabbi Yossi Haglili's halacha that the original Pesach that the Jewish people had at the time of Exodus, the Isser Chametz was only 1 day instead of 7 days? Where does he know that from? Ibois ema b'desamach le hayom, ibois ema smuchin lo doris. I'll give you two answers. One answer is that Rabbi Yehuda says that, again, you kill two birds with one stone. That the fact that the word Hayom is mentioned right after the pasuk is how I know that idea about the historical Pesach. But the pasuk in totality also teaches me that chametz before or after Pesach is going to be aser. You use the pasuk for both. Or alternatively, he bichlal Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan smuchim. He says that you can't make such a connection just because the following pasuk says Hayom atem yotzim. It does not mean that you're allowed that you have the ability to connect that in any way to the previous pasuk, because Rabbi Yehuda's shita is, because of the principle of ein mukdam u'ma'uchar b'Torah, there is no chronological order in the Torah, then the psukim cannot be connected to each other. It's only in Sefer Devarim, like the Gemara Yevamos speaks out, that Rabbi Yehuda agrees that you can darshan smuchim. Anyway.
Well, therefore he holds that they kept 7 days?
And therefore he holds that the original historical Pesach, the Isser of Chametz, did apply for all 7 days. Amar Mar. So now that concludes our Brisa. Now we're going to analyze the Brisa. Uminayin la'ochel Chametz misheishos u'lamayla shehu over below saseh. So Rabbi Yehuda had spoken out. How do you know that if a person eats Chametz from Chatzos and onwards, that he incurs a mitzvah lo saseh? Shenamar lo sochal alav chametz divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you may not eat with the korban pesach chametz. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. So Amar lo Rabbi Shimon b'chi efshel omar kain v'lo kvar namar lo sochal alav chametz shivas yamim tochal alav matzos. That Rabbi Shimon says the latter part of that verse clearly indicates that the Yisra chametz is only during chametz but not before. So the Gemara's question now is Rabbi Yehuda shaper karmelei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon good gefrekt. He's asking a good question. So how is Rabbi Yehuda going to respond? The Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lacha Hahu Lakova Ochova Afilu Bizman Hazehu Da'asa. Rabbi Yehuda's response is no. The latter part of that pasuk is not coming to tell you the time limitations of the Isser Chametz, but is rather coming to teach you that the obligation to eat matzah is still extant even when you can no longer bring the korban pesach. And how does it teach you that? It tells you might have thought that the only time, since the Torah says al matzos umrorim yochluhu, that you have to eat the korban pesach together with matzah and moror, you might have thought that the obligation to eat matzah is only extant so long as you can bring the korban pesach. But how do you know that when there's no longer a Beis HaMikdash and you no longer bring the korban pesach, that the mitzvah of achilas matzah still applies? So the Torah therefore connects it to the Isser of Chametz. That as long as there's an Isser of Chametz, which is perpetual, so too there's a perpetual mitzvah of eating matzah. That's the reason why the Torah connects the two together. But not to tell you that the Isser of Chametz is limited to the 7 days of Pesach. The Reb Shimon Lakova Chova Minoli. And where does Reb Shimon get that? If he uses the pasuk to tell you that the Isser of Chametz is limited to 7 days, so where does he get that idea that the mitzvah of matzah applies even after the Churban? So Nafgalei mi ba'erev tochlu. He learns it out from another pasuk which says, "From the evening you shall eat matzahs," which is an additional pasuk. Mi ba'erev tochlu. I could say almost homiletically that the word erev is a reference to Golus, because darkness, nighttime, is a reference to Golus. So even in the evening, when there's no Beis HaMikdash, you still have to eat matzah. But that's not the way Rashi learns. Rashi just says that it's the extraneousness of the pasuk that tells you that there's an additional obligation to eat matzah even when there's no Korban Pesach. The Rabbi Yehuda says, Mi boile, he says, I need that pasuk for something else. L'tamei v'shahaya b'derech rechoka. That's coming to teach me that there's still a mitzvah of matzah if a person is alive during the Beis HaMikdash period, but he cannot bring the Korban Pesach because either he's tamei or he's far away from Yerushalayim. Kasal gadaita chamina holu v'Pesach lo yochal matzah lo yochal matzah umar nami lo nechal. Kamash malan. I might have thought that since he's not able to partake of the Korban Pesach, then he also is not obligated to eat matzah and moror. Kamash malan be'erev tochlu matzos. Unconditionally, you have to eat the matzah no matter what. And so therefore, that pasuk is not available to teach me the principle that matzah applies even after Golus, and that's why I need the original pasuk. Reb Shimon Tamei b'shai b'derech rechoka lo itzrich. Reb Shimon's response to that is that you don't need a separate pasuk to tell you that a person who's tamei and far away from Yerushalayim still has an obligation to eat matzah. Delo gara me orelu ben nechar dichsiv v'chol orel lo yochal bo hu eino ochel aval ochel hu b'matzah uv'mor. Because I already have a pasuk which indicates to me that if a person is an orel, he's uncircumcised, or he's a ven nechar, which means that he is that he has some kind of problem in his faith system, which precludes him from being part of a chabur to partake in the Korban Pesach, but that he still has an obligation of eating matzah and moror. Once I have a pasuk to tell me that an orel and a ben nechar, a person with foreign ideology, foreign theology, still has an obligation to eat matzah, even though he cannot partake of the Korban Pesach, I apply that to a tamei and a guy who's b'derech rechoka. So I don't need a pasuk for that. And Rabbi Yehuda's response to that is ksiv bahai uksiv bahai. No, the Torah has a right to indicate by all four people that you're still obligated to eat matzah and moror. There's nothing wrong with the Torah using one pasuk to tell you an orel and a ben nechar, and a separate pasuk to tell you a tamei and mishahaya b'derech rechoka. And therefore, everyone uses the psukim for their own individual reasons. But in the final analysis, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's an isser of achila and an isser of hana'ah of chametz, both on erev Pesach and after Pesach, with chametz over lava Pesach. And according to Rabbi Shimon, the only isser deoraisa of possessing or eating chametz is only during the 7 days of Pesach itself. So now we go back to our original question. What was our original question? Money masnisim. Who is the author of our Mishnah? Reb Yehuda chametz stomach ha'amar afilu denachri. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, well, Rabbi Yehuda of our Mishnah had said that the only chametz that is usher is the chametz that was owned by a Jew. Only that chametz is usher after Pesach, but not the chametz that's owned by a Gentile. But Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying that all chametz that was in existence over Pesach is usher after Pesach. It makes no difference whether it was owned by a Jew or a non-Jew. So our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda. V'i Rabbi Shimon and Yisrael nami mishra kashari. And according to Reb Shimon, once Pesach is over, there's no longer a prohibition of chametz at all, even if it's owned by a Jew. And v'i Reb Yossi Haglili afilu tos manu nami mishra kashari bahana. And according to Reb Yossi Haglili, there's no prohibition of benefiting from chametz even during Pesach. So therefore, it would seem that according to Rabbi Yossi, there's bichlal. Certainly, our Mishnah can't go like, because our Mishnah says that there's a prohibition of ownership over Pesach and certainly of hana over Pesach. So, there's even an Isser if it was owned by Yisrael, even after Pesach, it certainly can't be like Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So how do we reconcile our Mishnah? Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov la'olam Rabbi Yehuda. So really the answer is that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yehuda. V'yoliv so'or da'achila miso'or diri'iyah. And basically he learns that there's a prohibition of leaven that's Yasser ba'achila. In other words, there's an Isser achila of chametz, and so too there's an Isser of bal yiro and bal yimatzeh. Like Rashi explains,
Just smash it.
Like Rashi explains, V'yolev so'or da'achila kolomar chametz degabi lo ye'achel miso'or diri'iyah. He learns the Isser of eating chametz from the Isser of possessing or having chametz in your possession. Umutter chemso shel nachri af ba'achila va'afilu b'pesach min haTorah. That, in other words, the Torah only prohibits ownership of chametz when it's owned by a Jew. But because the Torah says, lo yera'eh lecha, it may not be seen to you, which means by a Jew. So therefore, just like by ownership of chametz, it may not be seen by you, i.e., be owned by you, but it's only owned by a Jew. Is there an isser? But not if it's owned by a Gentile, because that's what's implied by the words lecha, to you, i.e., the Jew. So too, aval ataro shel acherim v'shel gavoa, or if it's owned by Hashem, that's also okay, meaning if it's hektish. Af so'or da'achila shel cha'iyata ochel avata ochel shel acherim. So too, leaven, when there's an isser of eating leaven after Pesach, the isser of eating leaven after Pesach only applies to the leaven of a Yisrael, but does not apply to the leaven of a Goy. And basically what we're doing is we're modifying Rabbi Yehuda's Shita. Even though Rabbi Yehuda says that there's an Isser Achila of Chametz after Pesach, that's only Isser Achila of when it's possessed by a Jew, when it was possessed by a Jew over Pesach. But if it was owned by Hektish or if it was owned by a Gentile, then you are allowed to eat it after Pesach. And really, the Mishnah, our Mishnah should have said, because if you look at our Mishnah carefully, it just says that it's mutter bahana'a, that if it was owned by a Gentile, it's mutter bahana. Really, the Mishnah should have written it's mutter even ba'achila. Ba'aydi the Tana di Yisrael aser bahana, Tananami denachri mutter bahana. But the reason why it said that it's a mutter bahana is because since we're going to talk about that a Yisrael's is aser bahana, for symmetry it said that a nachriz is mutter bahana, but really a nachriz is mutter even ba'achila. Uvidinhu di boile lemisna da afilu b'toch zmano mutar bahana, and really it should have also said in our Mishnah that the only isser of bal yirah, bal yimatzeh, of getting any hana'ah from chametz is when it's owned by a Yisrael. And that therefore applies even during the 7 days of Pesach, meaning that there's no isser hana'ah of a nachri's chametz. You're allowed to have it in your house. You can have a Gentile bring the chametz into your house. You can benefit from it in some way, right? But va'ayde de tana di Yisrael la'achar zmano, tana nami de nachri la'achar zmano. But the only reason why we're talking about after Pesach is because since we're talking about the chumrah of a Yisrael's chametz is aser bahana even after Pesach, we talked about a nachri's chametz is mutter bahana after Pesach. But in reality, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's bichlal no isser of hana'ah of a goy's chametz, neither during Pesach or after Pesach. And therefore, our Mishnah is consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. So that's one opinion that we've seen, and we'll Mir Hashem continue with another way of interpreting the Mishnah tomorrow.
Sure.